All right, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Rav Natan Alexander. I'm the founder of Leader of the Pack and David Shield Foundation. But what's really important, and I'm a volunteer firefighter, but what's really important is the man on the other side of the screen. I'm going to ask Skip to introduce himself, and then I'll tell you all how we met. So, Skip, please introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi. Good morning. My name's Skip Strauss, and I'm also a volunteer firefighter. I was also a full-time paramedic, and I ran a chaplaincy program for 20 years in southeast Texas, in the Houston, Texas area.
So Skip is a very, very humble man, and firefighters all around the world have a deep brotherhood. But we got to create a connection just under a year ago, I think, when Leader of the Pack went to Livingston, Texas. And before we got there, I was looking at the map on Google Maps to see my surroundings, and I'm like, ooh, there is a fire station, like 7 minutes walk down the road from where we were staying. And so I called the fire station, and it wasn't the emergency number, so there was no reply. So I emailed, and I got an email almost immediately back from Skip introducing himself as a chaplain. And the Leader of the Pack men were very, very honored that we became part of a training exercise while we were in Livingston. And it was great to get some of the guys a bit busy with what we do as firefighters. But more than that is the relationship, because men need relationship. Women find it quite easy to create relationship between them, but men find it a little bit more difficult. And I think, therefore, having something that we both are passionate about, a mission that we both believe in, means that it's created a foundation for Skip and I to have a relationship between us. And we message each other every so often, checking in how you're doing and things like that. Skip was at ground zero. This video is really to honor those that fell on 9/11, the victims that were in the towers, in the planes, and also those men and women, the first responders. Some of you may have seen an LOP video that I put out a few years ago about maintaining the honor for first responders, because what they do is have total disregard for their own safety in order to save and look after people that they don't even know. And 9/11 was a real world example of that. So, Skip, do you want to tell us a little bit about your 9/11 and the weeks that followed?
Yeah, I guess best place to start is at the beginning, as they say. I was off. I was at home. I just got through doing my morning Bible study, and I heard I was listening to a Christian radio station here in Houston, and the announcer came on and said a small plane has just hit the World Trade Center in New York City, and I said, "Okay, why is that news here? A small plane." So I went into the living room and I turned the TV on, and it wasn't a small plane at all. Obviously, a large plane had hit it, and the one of the towers was on fire. And as I watched live as that second plane hit the second tower, and one of my first thoughts was back to fire department training, was that was a secondary device designed to take out first responders. And so I knew almost instantly that hundreds of our brothers with FDNY had died. Um, and we all watched the horror that developed that morning. It was a Tuesday morning, And of course, tomorrow is the 22nd anniversary. Falls on a Monday. Hard to believe 22 years have gone by. Um, so I immediately started calling the chaplain's office at FDNY, and I would get a busy signal, or it would just ring and no answer, or I'd get uh, just constant busy signal. So I knew they were inundated. Um, so I sent an email. No, I got an email. I got an email from somebody that had been following our chaplaincy online at our website that we had back then. And he was a retired FDNY paramedic. And he said something to the effect, I'm sure you're all already on the way up here. Um, so I wrote him back and I said, no, they've already put out the word Tuesday afternoon that the city of New York was going to handle the scene, and they were asking all volunteers to turn around. And so we knew it was going to have to be by invite.
Mm.
So, make a long story short, he put me in touch with his ex partner, who was now at the time the paramedic supervisor with one of the hospital 911 ambulances that teams up with the 911 service in New York City. And it took me, I think, till Friday to get hold of her. And I told her what I did, and she says, "Well, um, Michael Judge, who was one of the FDNY chaplains, was killed. In fact, he was death certificate 001 um, that day." And she says, and he's the only one that kind of hung out with EMS at all. So I know we could use you. And I told her, of course, flights were suspended nationwide. And I told her that I would get a hold of her just as soon as I could get up there. Um, Sunday, I was able to get a ticket. And so Monday, I boarded a plane for New York City and let her know I was on the way. Her husband, who was a lieutenant with FDNY Communications, was supposed to pick me up at the airport. And, a little side note, we flew in, and by the way, there was only like 30 people on a plane designed for 200, because who wants to fly? And and we flew. I thought it was really weird on our approach. We came in right over Lower Manhattan, and it was right at dusk, as I recall, and you could see all the gold, street lights of the city, but right in the middle of that were all these stark white lights, and those were the rescue lights at Ground Zero. And of course, from what we were probably 8,000 feet, 5,000 feet, whatever, coming in, it's hard to get a size perspective, but it was a big sight. And I thought, how weird that, you know, all of this started with two aircraft and we're flying right over the side. I just thought it was kind of bizarre. Anyway, we landed and couldn't get hold of her or her husband. Um, he was not there to pick me up. After about an hour, now I've got on my polo shirt that has the fire department logo on it, the Maltese cross. and then it says Fire Chaplain on the back. And so I walked up to a street cop out directing traffic on the curb at the airport, and I told him what was going on. And he goes, "Yeah, we'll get you taken care of." So he called a squad car who came and picked me up, and they took me to the airport police station. And it was when I got there that I realized how immense the impact was. I think because there was concrete barricades up in front of the police station. There was police officers walking around with automatic weapons. Um, I mean, it looked like a fortress. And so God had a plan for me, I believe, even starting there because uh, it took about 5 hours before her husband picked me up. In that 5 hours, um, walked into the police station, and it was like what you see in movies and TV with the white shirted lieutenant sitting at the front desk, and he sends me back to the coffee room. Little did I know this was a Port Authority police station, and little did I know that the Port Authority has cross-trained firefighters, and they do the ARF, the aircraft rescue firefighting. And so the window in the coffee shop actually looked out into the bays where the crash rescue trucks are. So I thought that was interesting. I said, yeah, okay, God put me in a place here. And these guys would walk in to have coffee, and and that's when I was first introduced to a cannoli too. I don't know if you're familiar with that pastry, but man, that's good. And they'd find out I'm a chaplain, and they would start talking. And one thing I learned very quickly is that in New York City, uh, and as you know, the brotherhood in the fire service, no matter where you are, you're a brother. And it's
Yeah.
the same way with law enforcement. And in New York City, it's multi generational. So it wasn't just FD&Y. Of course, there was New York City police officers were killed, and some Port Authority police officers were killed because, as I recall, one of their headquarters was in one of the towers for Port Authority police, and so everyone graduated with somebody that was missing, or knew somebody that was missing, or was related to somebody that was missing that I talked to. And that's kind of how it all started. Um, then my friend's husband finally picked me up. Um, uh, at the time, still, this was 6 days into it, right? Day six. And all the bridges into lower Manhattan were closed unless you had ID. And of course, he had ID. Uh, and I first meet her. Her name's Lori. At about 2 o'clock in the morning on the ramp of the ER at the hospital where her ambulances were based, and she had been up for pretty much 6 days straight. Had
Oh.
been down to the pile because they were missing three of their paramedics. Uh, uh, that, of course, we found out later had perished. Um, and just a brief introduction, and she goes, "Hey, we have a memorial service at 8 o'clock in the morning in Central Park for the missing medics, and normally that's something that Father Judge would have done. So tag, you're it." And I said, "Okay." And so ended up spending the night in the nurses' dorm at a training hospital, which of course was empty, that had been evacuated. And I say spend the night because didn't sleep obviously, but maybe an hour. And up the next morning and leading that memorial service in Central Park. She joked with me because apparently I've got a slight Texas accent, and she says, we'll get you to lead it, but she said I'll probably need to get you an interpreter. And I went, yeah, okay, I get it. Um, so after we got back, she asked me if I could just do ride outs, and I remember I was full time a paramedic and a volunteer firefighter. So I started riding out on her ambulances with the crews that had survived, and just watching them. Remember 911 doesn't quit, and so we're answering routine calls and just hanging out with those guys and letting them talk and vent and so roughly 24 hours after that, um, about 11 o'clock in the morning, I get a phone call finally from the FDNY chaplain's office. And he says, I'm Chaplain Wapston. And he says, uh, you made a call. And he's kind of, cutting me short, how can I help you kind of thing. And I said, well, I'm a fire service chaplain. And I said, I'm in town now. If I can do anything at all for you. And he asked me if I was a member of the Chaplain Federation of Chaplains, and I said yeah. And he asked me if I was critical incident stress management trained, and I said yes, sir, to the advanced level. And he said I'll be there in 10 minutes, and I went, wow. So of course I had a backpack. That's what I was living out of, and he picked me up and took me down to ground zero for my first time. Um, you tell me, you want me to just keep going, or do you want
Yeah,
to?
yeah, it's yeah, keep going.
Okay, so um, we pulled up. I had brought my chaplain helmet and had my polo on, and we pulled up. And I remember parking on a sidewalk. He parked on a sidewalk, and we opened his trunk, and he had a FDNY bunker coat that he gave me, and he
Mm.
says, "Go ahead and wear this. That way they'll know you're with me." And uh, and it turned out to be the church where they had laid Michael Judge's body after he was killed 6 days prior, or at this point 7 days prior. And we're looking at Tower Five, which is still on fire.
Mm.
This is
A week
day seven.
later.
A week later, and Tower Five is still on fire. Now everybody heard Tower One, Tower Two. Um, 8 buildings were destroyed.
Wow.
This was a huge complex. I think I remember them saying 16 acres were involved. So 8 buildings completely destroyed and 21 buildings with ancillary damage. So I remember thinking, it was so surreal. It was like looking at a movie set, is the best way
Mm.
I can describe it, except it was real life with rubble and dust everywhere. And um, turned left on that street and go up towards, there was a fire station right across from the South Tower, which is Tower 2, the tent house, they call it. And I don't know how it is in Israel, but in the U.S., the norm, I guess, is that you would have Station 10, and out of Station 10 would be Engine 10 or and
Mm.
Tanker 10 or Ladder 10, right? Well, in New York, it's generally they'll call it like the 7-in-1 houses where I stayed, which would be 7 engine and 1 truck.
Okay.
So yeah, so the 10 house I guess was aptly called because it was 10 engine and 10 truck, which was kind of
Mm.
unusual. Um, and walked in there, and of course the bays are empty because both pieces of apparatus had deployed across the street and were destroyed. You know, when the towers came down, and something that struck me there is they had a big uh, like painting on the wall, and it was a painting of the twin towers, and um, no, it was a painting of the tin house, I think, and it said "waiting on the big one." Like
Wow.
we say in the fire service, we're always waiting on the big one. Yeah,
Wow.
yeah, yeah. And the tin house at that point had become like the command center, the forward command center. Like I said, 16 acres of destruction. So fire department had 4 command posts set up around the site. So each
Mhm.
responsible basically for 4 acres. And so Chaplin Waps, we it took us 8 hours to circumnavigate the site that first night. Um,
That's
and,
exciting.
yeah, and we got back to the fire station I was going to eventually live at for 5 weeks, um, about 4 blocks away, at about 4 o'clock in the morning, and that became a typical day. Was about 20 hours a day that we would work, and then basically go pass out for about 4 hours.
Wow.
Um, and he got me assigned to First Battalion, which was all the companies in Lower Manhattan, and uh, was quite an honor. It was to work amongst that many people. Um,
What
that
was what was the feeling
I
like?
can't I can't hear you.
What was the feeling like amongst the men and women who were working on the sites?
Um, they kind of looked like me. They looked like the deer lights look, right?
Mm.
Everybody. Uh, One thing cool, Chaplain Wapst, not Chaplain Wapst, Father Judge, Chaplain Judge, apparently had a great sense of humor, and so anytime we would bring up Michael Judge, the firefighters would get a smile on their face, you
Mm.
know, which was great. You he said he apparently uh, one of his things was one of his sayings was if you're gonna pray with a firefighter, keep it short. And yeah,
I
yeah,
get that.
uh,
As a rabbi, volunteer firefighter, I totally get that. 100%.
yeah, yeah. Uh, but the main thing, they call chaplaincy the ministry of presence, right?
Mm.
I'm not here to fix anything, and something
Mhm.
this size can't be fixed.
Yeah.
Uh, what I am here to do is listen,
Mm.
and you just let them talk.
Mm.
Um, at the time was probably the one of the most cathartic things that we could do.
Yeah. What was the feeling amongst the men and women that were working on site? And we're talking about a week, 8 days after the towers collapsed.
Yeah, well, by this time, crews were divided up into 5-man squads, just like they were on an engine company, right? Um, and they might be assigned to a part of the pile where they're actually hand digging, going through um, with 5-gallon buckets. Um, I can't begin to adequately describe what the site looked like. It was, I don't know, they said something like 1 million square feet of office space was compressed into basically 4 stories above ground and 5 stories underground, and all these crushing forces. So all she saw was steel and rebar and dust. Not even rebar. I don't. It was just mainly steel and chunks of concrete and dust. I never saw something that would identify that it was an office building, right? You didn't see any computers or desks, or it was just complete and total annihilation. I mean, it was like, I guess, walking on the surface of them. You could feel when you walked up on the pile, you could actually feel it undulating, because of the heavy equipment, the cranes, and the giant claws used to remove the steel I beams. And
Mm.
uh, I
What
remember,
sorry, you're going.
yeah, I remember walking down a sidewalk, and there was the engine. Was it the engine? No, it was a wheel landing gear of one of the aircraft laying there.
Wow.
Um, I I don't know. It was. I remember when they found one of the tower trucks that got uncovered in the rubble. This was probably a week into it or so, maybe longer, and it was on the end of a crane. So imagine a what 60-foot long ladder truck suspended in the air. It was just again just surreal is uh, best way I could describe it.
And the feeling amongst the men and women that were working there. Can you
Yeah,
describe
yeah.
that?
They were just searching for their brothers. Uh, the only time that they would really open it up is when you'd get alone with them at one of the fire stations, and they would they wanted to talk about what they were doing when it happened.
Mm.
I talked to one firefighter, um, who, by the way, 17 men from his station went to ground zero, and 14 of them were killed. And when the uh, second tower went down, he said he ran so hard that he actually ran out of his bunker boots. Didn't
Wow.
know where those bunker boots were.
Wow.
Um, some of them would describe, many people don't know this or don't remember this, but like over 200 people jumped to their death out of the tower rather than burn up.
Yeah.
And some of these guys can tell you what that looked like and what that sounded like.
Mm.
Can you imagine? Um,
Because the first responders are exactly that. They were there before the towers were falling and they witnessed this all.
yeah, so the house where I lived, the 701 house, was also the headquarters for Battalion 1 and Chief Pfeiffer. And there's video of him and his crew. They were actually out on I think, a gas smell out of a manhole cover. And they're standing there doing their investigation, and that first plane went right over the top of them. And in the documentary, Chief Pfeiffer got on the radio and said, "Be advised, this looks like an intentional attack."
Hmm.
Um, and he has the experience. I say that because I found out later that he was the battalion chief at the '94 bombing. Many
Wow.
people forget that a guy tried to bomb the World Trade Center by placing a bomb in the basement. So he knew the World Trade Center intimately. Um, but yeah, those guys that you saw in that documentary video is who I worked with and lived with. Yeah.
What was your role once you got to ground zero?
What was what? I'm sorry.
What was your role as a chaplain at ground zero?
Yeah. Uh, for the first uh, for the first 3 days, I worked on the pile, assigned to First Battalion, and uh, and so I was responsible for two of the command centers. So anytime they found a member of service, an MOS, that had perished, and we should mention that 343 firefighters were killed that day. 343.
Wow.
Um, that's triple the normal yearly total of line of duty deaths in the U.S.
Wow.
Runs about 100. So 343 firefighters had died. Uh, I believe it was 69 police officers, 13 of which I think were Port Authority. I don't remember the exact numbers. Um, so when they would find a member of service uh, and they were ready to extricate the remains, um, they would do it. Typically, what I saw was in a man basket or in a Stokes basket, and we would cover the remains in an American flag. And one operation that I watched for about 45 minutes to its completion, they actually brought the man basket out on the end of a crane, the Stokes basket. And I remember the mayor of New York City was standing next to me as we did this, and uh, I would offer up a prayer as all the firefighters were at attention, and then at the end of the prayer, everybody would come to attention and salute, and the remains would be removed in a miniature ambulance, like a golf cart ambulance, that was used to take the remains to the forward morgue tent. They had a morgue tent set up there, and that was a pretty powerful moment. Um, but that's what I did for the first 3 days on the pile was just stop and talk to the 5 member crews, and and uh, cheer them up with some of Michael Judge's sayings, and just encourage them. And I was not surprised at all the number of firefighters that had volunteered later. I think in my second or third week that um, this became, of course, the world's largest crime scene, right?
Yeah.
And so there was everybody there, ATF and FBI and everybody there. And these guys that from the fire department that volunteered to stay on the pile and just keep working. They just and so the guys, as I recall, there at 701 House, a bunch of them became part of the FEMA forward operating team that would go out and GPS the location of each piece of human remain that they found. Uh, yeah. I remember. I remember speaking to the father of a missing firefighter, presumed dead. You know, because now we're 10 days in, 11 days in, and he was convinced that his son, who was a former Marine, was still alive.
Mm.
And so I was asked to escort him around the site, and we got only maybe an hour into it, and I noticed he wasn't standing next to me anymore. So I turned around and I went back to him, and he had tears coming down his face, and he said, "He's not coming home, is he?" And I said, "No, sir, I don't believe he is." Um, just powerful moments.
Yeah. It's a tragic thing when you put hope together with reality. And
Yeah,
sometimes I'm sure in your role as chaplain, um, there's a process to understand what reality is. And the entire world took a long time to realize what the reality was at ground zero. Um, you know, you are still carrying that reality that is far more real than all of us that were watching it miles away or hours away, as real as it was for the entire world, being there and with the survivors and with a father who, at that moment that you're with him and supporting him, realizes his son's not coming back. That is not moments that can actually be passed on and described to anybody. They must just be full of indescribable emotion.
yeah, you're right. It's I, and we've got to praise God even in the midst of 16 acres of total destruction, of how He used that and how He brought people through that. And in the U.S., really worldwide, the outpouring that we saw, but you know, people went back to church for the first time in years, and there was a renewed sense of patriotism.
That's for sure.
Uh, um, the world, I think, felt bonded together uh, after that, and it's a shame it takes a tragedy of that size and scope for that to happen.
Yeah.
Um, but God used it, and it's a shame that, I mean, to me, it seemed like within 3 to 5 years, people had already started to forget.
Yeah.
And now here we are 22 years removed, and almost like oh yeah, that
Yeah.
happened.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, as men who believe deeply in God, I believe that healing is a miraculous thing. But at the same time, there is such a danger to forgetting the power of an event because of that healing. And I know in the Jewish calendar, that's one of the reasons that the festivals come around every year. You've got your Passover and your New Year and your uh, tabernacles, and almost every 2 months there's another festival that happens again and again and again and again, so that the memory stays strong. You know, 4,000 something years later, we still celebrate the Exodus of Egypt, right? And
Right.
it's a powerful, strong thing, but there's also this negative side. So, you know, that balance of, we want the world to heal, but if we forget the pain, then the healing actually gets less and less. And
That's right.
you know,
That's
I'm
right.
much.
Let me show you something.
Please.
When did you give me this? Do you remember? First year, wasn't it? Yeah, my this is something my wife gave me. I think the first year, and it's let's see here. There we
Yeah.
go.
Wow.
So
Wow.
that, of course, was a famous picture that one of the newspapers put up of the firefighters raising the American flag in the midst of all the destruction. And so
Wow.
this sits by my desk to this day, and there's so I'll never forget. You
Yep.
know,
Yep. Once again, as once again, as men that lead communities and people turn to us for help with faith, there's a balance of healing but continuing to remember, and being allowing ourselves to feel the pain in order to remember. And we're just the first generation, Skip. We got children and grandchildren and great grandchildren that need to remember these tragedies, so that we bring more healing to the world.
well, you bring up all the Jewish tradition. You know, we can talk about it from the Christian viewpoint as well. If we forget what Jesus did for us, what God did for us through Jesus, um, we lost sight of the whole reason why God loves us so much, right?
Yeah,
Um, uh, we can't forget. We can't forget that sacrifice, and we can't forget the sacrifice of the men and women that died that day, as you said, running in when everybody else was running out.
yeah, yeah. You know, I think about that often. Those that ran in, and I actually had a discussion with one of my LOP brothers yesterday, and it was a bit of a debate about those that ran in to go and help. Is that something, and in your deep experience, not only of 9/11, but being a first responder for so many years, do you think that that is a character trait that someone has? Or do you think that's something that can be taught to people who don't?
I think it has to be God instilled. I believe. Oh yeah, you can train somebody to do what we do, but they're not going to last in the career, right? It has to be a calling. We see too many ugly things. Um, you know the old saying in our line of work. I wish my brain could forget what my eyes have seen,
Yep.
and I would add to it, and what my nose has smelled.
Yep.
And so I think it takes a true calling from God. And of course, I didn't realize that as a young kid, but I ran my first ambulance call as a senior in high school.
Wow.
And so this year is my 50th year of being involved in public safety. It's incredible to me, but it's not who I am, but it's certainly a big part of what God has shaped me to do.
Amen. And I only got to meet you for a few hours, our first meeting, and I'm sure there'll be many, many more. But there's a great humility, and I know you're not going to receive this, but there's a great humility about you, and it's it's one of the balances that I also find as a first responder. There has to be this humility that one can run into a fire. You know, my brother-in-law is a paramedic, and he says we're nothing compared to the firefighters because we don't run in, you know, and there's got to be a balance of humility that we're here to do a job and God will protect us and whatever will happen. But at the same time, this self-belief of I'm not going to be a waste to run into that fire, and I'm not going to be a waste to run into those buildings because I have the ability to save lives. And I personally find there's this balance that I think only God really can move in a person of humility along with real powerful self-belief. Because if you don't believe in yourself, you ain't running into those buildings. You know, even if you got all the brothers beside you and all of that, that self-doubt, if that kicks in, you freeze. And so I think we are, and I'm nothing. I'm just a small volunteer, but the men and women that are on the front line every day, there is a godly balance of powerful self-belief and at the same time maintaining a humility that they're just there to serve, and whatever happens is what's meant to be.
Yeah, I appreciate you calling me humble, but pride has been a battle of mine, and I am proud to have served at Ground Zero. There not many people got to do that, um, but I don't want to be ever again prideful.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, the word says if we're going to boast, we're going to boast in the Lord, and that's
Yeah. Amen to that. I agree with that. Skip, can you tell me, if you don't want to share this, it's fine, but I know that there are thousands of people that suffered years later from things like PTSD. And I remember when we were together in Livingston, you told us how it only kicked in years later. And I think that we have the opportunity to create some awareness around how that stuff works. Um, if you can tell some of that story, whatever you feel comfortable with.
yeah, yeah. So I got diagnosed with PTSD 16 years after 9/11, and how it manifested in me was recurring nightmares uh, of always a large scale event where I didn't feel adequate, that I couldn't help, and to the point that I would wake up screaming and sweating and what they call night terrors. Um, and I sit here today and completely through that. In fact, the doctor released me from any kind of PTSD treatment. I mean, so
Wonderful.
not that I was ever normal, but I feel I
Neither
feel
of
like
us.
I feel like my old self again. And there used to be a lot of anxiety coming up on an anniversary,
Mm,
and I don't feel that anxiety anymore. But
mm.
it's taken a few years and uh, uh, and a few tears to get to that point.
I'm sure. I'm sure. Skip, I wanna wrap it up. I know that you're on your way to church, and I want to respect that. I just want to ask, as really a man of God and a humble man of God, who God gave you the opportunity to serve in the most powerful, humbling way that none of us should ever be blessed to do. What what lessons did you learn from humanity or about humanity there on the pile? Because I think a lot of people lost hope in humanity around that time.
Yeah.
So
Let
do
me.
you,
I'm going to answer that question. I got to plug this in. Would you bring me the plug real quick? Because this is fixing to die already. I got to get the computer plugged in.
no problem.
Thank you, dear. All right. There we go. We won't die now. Um, Humanity. I think that relates back to remembrance. Um, you know, as as I read in the Old Testament, how quickly the Israelites would forget. And just take let's just take the example of Moses approaching Pharaoh all those times and
Mm,
the miracles that they all saw performed. Not only would Pharaoh forget, right, but the people forgot.
yeah,
Humanity forgot.
yeah,
Then he watches as God leads them out of Egypt and to the edge of the Red Sea, watches God part the waters and dry the bottom so they could walk through. They watched as God closed the waters over the top of the entire Egyptian pursuing army right in front of their eyes. The most miraculous deliverance you've ever seen.
yeah,
And within 40 days, it's forgotten. 40 days.
yeah,
So, how much more so in an event that was witnessed by millions worldwide? I would say 40 days, the bulk had already forgotten.
yeah,
So I think that's the metaphor. That's humanity is quick to forget.
yeah, yeah. And that's why it's so important that these memorials come back around, and to go to the memorials and to take our children to memorials and to take our grandchildren to memorials and to remember, uh, to talk. I know, as a grandchild of Holocaust survivors, I know that my children are the last generation to ever meet a Holocaust survivor. And that in a way is a sign of healing, but at the same time it's treacherous, because who knows how quickly that memory will go once they, as the last generation, are gone. um, and we don't like to deal. I think human nature is one that doesn't like dealing with the negative and remembering the sad and the difficult. But we have a saying that says we praise God for the bad as much as we do for the good, because it all comes from Him. And that's a very difficult thing to say, and I don't, I don't understand it. But it is so important to remember the bad, even though it's difficult to do so. Um, Also, once again, if we don't really remember the difficult, then the good isn't that good. The good is much better when we remember how bad things were.
That's right.
So, Skip, I wanna thank you on behalf of leader of the pack and everybody. I guess I can represent Israel. I remember where I was in 9/11. I was actually on my way to visit who my now wife is in the old city of Jerusalem. And I was on a bus and I was actually attacked. The bus was attacked by certain people who were celebrating the disaster and the tragedy that was happening in America. And so, and millions of miles away. And so we are all connected even through tragedy. And may we be blessed, Skip, to be connected also through great joy and celebration in the world of good things. I think once again, our friendship, our brotherhood is an amazing sign to the world that a Christian man, a Jewish man, who are both very proud of our belief system, can love, honor, and respect each other and share in each other's pain and in each other's joy. And so I thank you for being that man on that side of the screen, and so willingly coming to speak to leader of the pack. I spoke to some guys last night and they said it's been one of the most powerful experiences they've had in all the years in leader of the pack to hear you speak. So thank you for that, and thank you for doing this with me as well. If you could leave a message for anyone who's watching this or in generations to come on 9/11, what would you say?
I could be trite and say never forget, um, but I think if we uh, place that at some prominence in our life, to say never forget our spiritual roots, never forget our family roots, never forget what God has gifted you with, and use what He's gifted you with. Um, Service to others. Um, Pray to God. Seek those gifts He has given you,
Mm.
and and apply them, and you will find out. Well, maybe that wasn't where He was calling me. That doesn't mean you stop seeking where it is, because He's called each one of us. He's called and gifted each one of us for something special in service of His kingdom. Um, our job, I believe, is to find what that is.
Amen. Skip, thank you, my brother. May you have a safe and powerful memorial. You're on your way to church now. I'm sure that they'll do some special ceremonies there. But I think that it's also important that anyone who's watching this realizes that in your church, your synagogue, your mosque, your community center, but also in your own home, your children and your grandchildren are the memory of survival. Whether you were there, whether you were not there, whether you've never been to ground zero or never been through, please God, never been through a terror attack. I've been through many. We need to teach our children and our grandchildren that discussions like this between men who are very different and believe some different things can find common ground to bring God and peace into the world. And Skip, thank you for being a major part of that, brother. I pray that we'll meet again in happy times.
Yeah, likewise. Likewise.
Okay, I'm going to stop the recording.